Thanks, Chair. It seems that the IMF and the Bretton Woods institutions are keen to rebrand themselves. And this bill seems to be linked to that effort by the IMF to rebrand itself. So structural adjustment programmes, the infamous structural adjustment programmes that were imposed by the IMF on this country and many other developing world countries, or countries that hit major economic crises, have proved utterly disastrous because of the conditions that were linked to these loans provided by the IMF and the World Bank. And really, the interventions of the IMF globally, to my mind, have been just a litany of disaster, where the conditions attached to so-called financial support from the IMF were such that they made bad situations worse, because invariably the conditions that were attached to the loans were conditions of austerity, conditions of privatisation, conditions of deregulation, and they were a way in which the very wealthy countries of the world, through a little bit like loan sharks, but at a more sophisticated level and at a grander scale than your loan shark, by lending you money and then having countries in debt to you, could dictate policy to countries that were recipients of those loans. For much of the neoliberal period, for want of a better word, since the beginning in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the damage that was wrought by the IMF and the World Bank was inflicted on developing world countries in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Africa. But then, as we saw with the crash, the economic crash of 2008, they came a hell of a lot closer to home, where the IMF, the infamous Troika, the IMF, the European Commission and the European Union imposed conditions of austerity on foot of loans to supposedly bail Ireland out after the financial crash created by bankers and developers. And the cost of that was absolutely crippling to this country. We are still in enormous debt, 230 billion euro, because of low interest rates. That is deemed to be sustainable. If, however, as is almost a racing certainty, interest rates begin to rise at a certain point, that debt burden could become absolutely crippling for this country. But as bad enough as that is, the debt burden that was imposed on us, on ordinary people as a result of the crimes of bankers and developers and the governments that facilitated them, were also linked then to absolutely cruel and senseless, utterly counterproductive austerity demands, the legacy of which remains with us. Most obviously in the housing crisis, where effectively social housing provision was stopped, direct state construction of public housing was effectively stopped for more than a decade, and we are paying a very, very bitter price for the demands of the Troika to impose austerity on public spending, and that has left us with an absolutely chronic housing crisis, inflicting extraordinary misery on ordinary working people just looking to do the simple thing of put a secure, affordable roof over their head. But the origin of that crisis, the extremity to which that crisis, the crisis did in fact predate the austerity programme, but became worse by multiple factors as a result of the IMF and Troika loan programme. And we are dealing with the consequences of that now, but we can also see it in our health service. Tens of thousands of staff were taken out of the public health service as a result of the austerity measures, and we are now dealing with chronic capacity deficits in our health service, and that is reflected today with hundreds and hundreds of people on trolleys because we butchered the health service in order to get the bailout, supposedly, from these institutions. It is also worth pondering the connection between IMF policies and war. You see, often we, particularly now that we are considering the horrors of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but it is worth just considering the connection between war and civil breakdown and IMF loans and structural adjustment programmes. These are things that are rarely commented on. It is rarely commented upon that preceding the current conflict in Ukraine, what was in place? A structural adjustment programme imposed by the IMF, imposing neoliberal policies, austerity and so on the people of Ukraine, doing very considerable economic damage, in my opinion, to that country. It is worth noting that preceding the Balkans war, the civil war that tore Yugoslavia apart and left, the horrendous crimes of ethnic cleansing and so on, the rise of horrific forms of nationalism in the Balkans, that there had been a structural adjustment programme imposed by the IMF in advance of that. Crippling austerity, wholesale privatisation of the public and state enterprises in that country. And in fact, preceding the Balkans war, there had been massive revolts by working people, regardless of ethnicity, whether they were Serb, Croat or Slovenian. Together, united, working class people were on the streets against IMF austerity. And it is arguable, in fact I am absolutely convinced it is the case, that part of the reason you had the bloody civil war in the Balkans, the first encroachment of this kind of serious war and conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War, was because when the ordinary people revolted against, in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia, against IMF, privatisation and austerity, the leaders of the Yugoslav regime decided to play the nationalist card in order to divert attention, divide and rule, and deflect legitimate anger against economic austerity into a horrible campaign of nationalism and ultimately of ethnic cleansing and war. And I think it's important to remember that. You look at what preceded the Arab Spring was the imposition of structural adjustment programmes in places like Egypt by Hosni Mubarak and other regimes in North Africa and the Middle East, imposing crippling austerity and the wholesale privatisation of industries. And of course, always that privatisation, by the way, was linked to corruption, because the states that were willing to privatise state enterprises inevitably privatised them to the benefit of their mates, the clique around the government that was imposing them. Just a bit like in this country. When we privatised telecom, we created billionaires like Dennis O'Brien. They were the people who benefited. When we talk about oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, and where do they come from? They came from the wholesale privatisation of state enterprises and state industries in the Russian economy, and they created this whole layer of horrible oligarchs who then control the former state industries, and you produce from that the sort of horrible regime we see with Putin. But that scenario, that phenomena, is not limited to Russia. As horrible and as obnoxious as its particular manifestation in Russia is, but actually this was a more global phenomena, where the insistence of the IMF, the World Bank, on linking loans to privatisation and austerity has proved a disaster, and usually assisted in the destabilisation of these countries, and often in the production of civil wars resulting certainly of wholesale corruption and often full-scale war, as the warring brothers of those who ran those states played cynical games of whipping up nationalism and or whipping up militarism in order to deflect popular anger away from themselves and onto scapegoating particular groups or launching wars in order to divert people's attention away from the real problem, which was the impact of neoliberalism being pushed down their throats by the IMF, by the World Bank, and so on. So it is no surprise that against that background, the IMF wishes to rebrand, as this bill sets out to do. So instead of structural adjustment, the infamous structural adjustment, we now have much more benign-sounding grant and loan programmes such as poverty reduction and growth, and catastrophe containment and relief. Sounds beautiful. Sounds absolutely beautiful. But has anything actually changed? Because, of course, the states that dominate the IMF and the World Bank are the wealthiest and most powerful states, and inevitably they exercise their influence on the conditions that are attached to the loans that are given to poor countries who are forced to go looking for these loans and then to swallow the conditions that are attached to those loans, and inevitably the wealthy countries attach conditions which are beneficial to the wealthy countries and almost invariably operate to the detriment of the people who take the loans. And then they find themselves in hock to these institutions and essentially subject to the demands and whims of these institutions. Now maybe there has been something of a recognition among some of these institutions and some of the big Western powers who dominate them that neoliberalism is a disastrous experiment that failed. And we saw some of that recognition during COVID. Because, of course, when you're actually faced with a situation of having an emergency, a public health emergency, you suddenly realise that, for example, a privatised health service isn't a really very good idea. The idea that you'll have a two-tier health service where you have a public health service that's overrun, but then you have private hospitals that have excess capacity but which can only be accessed by people who have the money to pay exorbitant levels of private health insurance. Suddenly, it dawns on people, well, actually, that's not actually the best type of health system to have facing into a public health emergency where actually the health of everybody is linked to the health of everybody else. But of course, there is a serious question. So, unprecedented measures were taken during COVID, including the integration for a brief period of the private health service into the public health service. But of course, it was still done in the neoliberal way. Instead of actually fully integrating and absorbing the private health service into a fully public, single-tier national health service, we just paid out huge amounts of money to the private owners of the health system, refusing to break from the privatised public health model, and we see the same with housing. So yes, there's a recognition. We've got a housing crisis. We made a massive mistake doing what the IMF and so on told us to do after the crash of 2008 by stopping building public housing. But actually, have we really learned the lesson? Not really. When you look at what's actually happening, we're still sourcing the vast majority of so-called social housing from private developers through Part 5, through leasing arrangements, through the purchase of property from private developers, and so on. So it's seriously doubtful. There's been some rhetorical shift by these institutions in the way they seek to brand their operations, whether it's at the international level of the IMF or at the state level of countries like Ireland, but it is seriously questionable. In fact, I'm certain that there's been no real fundamental shift away from the neoliberal mindset that produced such a disastrous economic crisis in 2008 and produced such a disastrous response to it in the form of structural adjustment programmes. And of course, what we suffered was minor, as horrendous as it was, compared to what many countries in Africa, in the Middle East and Latin America had suffered in the 1980s at the hands of these institutions. Some vague recognition on the part of these institutions that the neoliberal model has failed and that we have to brand itself, I take as some sign of pressure on them and on governments to begin to shift their thinking, but there's really very serious questions as to whether they're actually going to shift their practice and whether this is just rebranding and whether we will continue to have the same disastrous conditions attached to these loans, particularly when things begin to get tight. And we may well suffer very, very serious consequences as a result of that when you look at the debt burden that this country now has, owed out to these sorts of institutions that impose such disastrous conditions on their loans after the crash of 2008. And really, what I think, and we argued, but of course we were resisted hotly by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the Greens switched their position, I think, depending on whether they're opposition or government, in terms of actually getting rid of these debts, of writing off these debts. They should have been written off for many of the countries who had them inflicted on them in the developing world in the 1980s and 1990s. And in my opinion, those debts should still be written off today. Because, in the end of the day, what are these loans being given out? Catastrophe loans, loans dealing with poverty, often they are simply filling the gap created by the conditions that were attached to the loans that were given previously. So rather than simply rebranding the structure of wealthy countries and wealthy people lending countries money to fill the gaps created by their own previous disastrous mistakes, we should actually be thinking about a new international order and eliminating the inequality that requires countries to take these kind of loans in the first place, and where countries are essentially subject to an economic system that is dominated by very large corporations and the states associated with those corporations who use their incredible wealth in order to try and grab hold of resources and grab hold of markets in order to increase their profits. Never are they interested in the welfare of the people in these countries, but only interested about how their loans could possibly increase their spheres of influence or their access to certain markets by lending money and attaching certain conditions to it. So I'm not holding my breath on the rebranding of the IMF, but certainly if they feel the need to rebrand, it is demonstrative of the fact that they can no longer stand over the disastrous priorities and policies they've pursued for the last 20 years, and maybe that will create the space where we can actually argue for a fundamental break from the disastrous policies of neoliberalism and towards a different type of international order, which is about actually meeting the needs of society, meeting the needs of human beings, and using the incredible wealth that exists in our world in order to satisfy the basic needs of people for housing, for health, for education, for decent infrastructure, decent public services. And indeed, if we did that, if we put that sort of emphasis, we might see less wars and less military conflict of the terrifying sort we're seeing both in Europe, in Yemen, in the Middle East, and in many parts of the developing world.